Thanks for visiting the Contract Bank. I'm business attorney Roxanne Smithers. In this video, we're going to be talking about the Master Photography Services Agreement. And that's a pretty self-explanatory name. This agreement is going to be providing terms and conditions for photographers, laying out the relationship that you'll have with your customers or clients. And it's set up as a master agreement so that if you're having return clients, you don't have to sign a new contract each time that client comes back to you for photography services. You can simply issue another scope of work or scope of services. And we'll discuss that later in the agreement. But let's get started looking through the terms to make sure that you have an understanding of what you're getting with this agreement. So the first section has some general information about the terms of services, but the specifics of that section will be in an exhibit that we'll talk about later. So once we get into the meat, the first thing we're going to have here then is Section 2. Section 2 discusses the process by which a customer or client will reserve your services, reserve a session with you, or reserve your time. Section 3 deals with fees and expenses. This section is going to give you some of the general information about how you are going to be paid and whether or not you will be also able to charge clients for any additional costs or expenses that you incur as part of those services above and beyond your standard fee. The next Section 4 gets into a little bit more of the detail of that session time and when and how the parties can make changes to that scope of work, either to this time or to the type of session that you are going to have. Section 5 deals with weather. In the event that your session is intended to be outdoors, we've got some language in here that details what the parties need to do in such a situation in terms of having backup location, backup date, or opportunities that may be necessary to protect yourself, your equipment, or the team that may be with you from inclement weather for any outdoor sessions. Section 6 covers location and specifically discusses how the parties are going to handle a location that neither party controls and whether or not there are any permits or other requirements and permissions that may be needed for a specific location that your customer or client wants to use for their session. Section 7 details rest breaks and meals. This section is intended for longer sessions that you may have as a photographer, particularly if you are being asked to photograph an event. And we basically have a threshold for any session that's going to be over 3 hours. We've built in some time for you and your team to have breaks in those sessions, and also for you and your team to have some refreshments or meal if the event that you are photographing includes a meal. Section 8 discusses the process by which the parties, either you or your client, can cancel a session and what happens if a client decides that they want to cancel a session. Section 9 covers the event in which you are not able to perform. You are subject to an illness or an injury or some other circumstance beyond your control that makes it impossible for you to attend a scheduled session. And so this provision discusses what happens in that situation. Section 10 details intellectual property rights and specifically says that as the photographer, you own the copyright to the images that you photograph, and that you will be issuing to your client a license for the use of those images, either as print or digital copies. And it details some additional requirements that you may want to have for customer or clients in terms of providing you with photo credit and limiting the client's ability to commercialize the photography, to commercialize the products without your permission. Section 11 details the timeline of this agreement, i.e. the term, and it also details the manner by which either you or your customer or client can cancel the agreement. This provision also addresses what happens if the full agreement is canceled while you still have pending scopes of work or scopes of services, and how the parties can handle those pending scopes of work or scopes of services. Section 12 is a provision that limits your liability, the type of damages that you can be liable for if there is some sort of loss or injury to a client, and can also be modified to put a limit on the amount of damages, the actual dollar amount that you can be liable for. Section 13 covers indemnification. And indemnification is a fancy word for the party that caused a wrong being responsible for the damages or losses resulting from that wrong. For example, if your client decides to utilize a location that they don't actually have permission or permit to utilize, and for some reason you are charged with a ticket or any other claim from the owner of that location for the unauthorized use of that location. Well, this provision states that ultimately your customer will be responsible for any damages or any losses that you incur as a result of their failure to get permission to use that location. They will have to indemnify you. Section 14 and 15 make it clear that you are an independent contractor and that you are not an employee of the client, that you are free to provide services to other clients, and your client is free to also obtain services from other photographers. This is not an exclusive relationship between the parties. Sections 16 and 17 discuss and deal with what happens if the parties are in a dispute that has to be resolved with regards to their performance under this agreement or their obligations under this agreement. We have a provision that details what state's law is going to apply, and then we also have the provision that lays out a roadmap for resolution of those disputes. Starting with negotiation, the parties have an opportunity to mediate, and then ultimately, if they're not able to come to terms, the parties have the opportunity to arbitrate their dispute. Section 18 details the proper way to provide notice with regards to any issues in the contract to the other party. Notice should be in writing, and there's a process for that here. Sections 19 and 20 are really for a judge, a jury, or an arbiter in terms of how to actually apply the language in this contract to any dispute that you may have with your client or customer. And then section 21 makes it clear that the full universe of your agreement with your client or customer is what's contained in this written document, and that if the parties want to make changes, they have to both agree, and those changes have to be done in writing. And then finally, we are also going to have our schedule of services, and this is where you can detail out the photography session information, the type of session, date, time, location. You can detail out your payment requirements, session fees, deposits that may be required, when deposits are due, if you have an hourly rate, and there are any other expenses that you anticipate and expect the customer to cover as part of the process. There's also language in here that provides the opportunity for you to give your client permission to utilize the images for commercial use. In the main part of the agreement, it says that they are not allowed to do so without your permission and without a release being signed to do so. There's language in this section that deals with how this scope of services or the schedule of services is canceled, what happens to your deposit, and what happens to any other fees that are due and owing to you if they cancel within a certain amount of time. You also have the option in this schedule of services to make any one-off modifications to the main agreement and how it will apply to this specific schedule of services. And then we've also included that photo release rider. So if you are inclined to allow the customer or client to utilize the images for commercial purposes, this rider gives you options in terms of what permissions you will allow. All sessions and all images, specific sessions, specific images, details whether or not this release is revocable, or whether or not this is a permanent release going forward. So you've got some options there as well. And then finally, we have an additional exhibit that provides an individual participant release. So this is a release that you will want to obtain from any other individuals that will be part of the session. This will protect both you and your client. If that's models, if those are volunteers, employees, anyone else that may be a part of that session, to make sure that they are providing permission for their image to be utilized by you and also utilized by the customer. We've even provided a section in case that participant is a minor, so that their parent or guardian can sign on their behalf. So this is a summary of the Master Photography Services Agreement. I want to thank you again for joining me in the Contract Bank, and I am your business attorney, Roxanne Smithers.